Well, good morning, Ken. I'm glad to be here with you. Some viewers of my channel will probably know that your name came up in one of our most recent episodes. We were talking with John Vervaeke and part of our Rethinking Religion series. And we referenced your work, and it became kind of a guiding theme for a good part of that conversation. You had another video where you had spoken with John Vervaeke on his channel and had talked about the theological and existential implications of Christ's cry on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And it was an interesting exploration, and that was inspiring in itself, and matched some of the themes that we have been exploring in the Rethinking Religion series. But in the course of that, I heard that you had your own YouTube channel that was called Climbing on Mount Sophia, and that really sparked something in me, because Mount Sophia has been a very significant symbol for me in my own work in recent years. And I haven't seen many other people actually put those two things together, the sacred mountain and Sophia, even though it's totally natural to do that. And so I was excited to see how you've been exploring that in your own journey, and using it as an organizing metaphor or something deeper. And I don't have big formal plans for any kind of interview. I'm hoping this can be a mutually exploratory conversation, a dialogos, hopefully, and just share what we have experienced in our adventures and pilgrimages on the slopes of Mount Sophia.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm thrilled to get to talk to you. I really enjoyed that video. It was a little bit of, I would say it staggered me a little bit to hear that my personal journey, really, because that's what it is, has kind of caused some questions, the kind of questions that came up in that conversation. That was, I'm still processing how that feels exactly, because on one hand, it feels, probably the most prescient or salient feeling that comes through with it is a kind of, I guess, awe, but awe with a sense of horror associated with it. Not because I'm unhappy about that. It's more the sense of the gravity of taking your own life seriously, in a sense. And if other people take notice of that, the gravity that portends across frame space. So yeah, but it was really wonderful too to hear that, getting to speak with John and a lot of the ways that his work has afforded opening in my life led to something positive like that. So thank you for bringing that up in that conversation. I appreciate that.
Sure.
In terms of Mount Sophia, it's a strange thing how the symbols can grab you. And that is how I would start to talk about my relationship to Mount Sophia, because I started the YouTube channel mostly to share videos of interesting conversations I was having with my father and my brother and my brother-in-law, who I dialogue with a lot. And I just kind of chose that name based on just kind of a vague feeling about it. I didn't really have a lot put into that. I understood, at least to some degree, the symbol of the sacred mountain, and I was becoming obsessed with wisdom, and so that kind of came together for me. But then since then, I would say it's become like a participatory symbol for me. It's probably the best way to say that, and I mean that in the deepest way I can use those two words, because I find that through the presencing of that symbolic perspective, I actually am able to, it's as if something comes over me a little bit, that kind of allows me to move into a different kind of space, especially in conversations, a different kind of space where landscapes become visible.
Mm-hmm.
So, you sent me a little bit of your formalized work surrounding Mount Sophia, and I was really excited to read some of them. I'm not, my academic philosophy I took an intro to philosophy class as an undergrad, and then John's work kind of is a huge part of who I am now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my framework toward philosophy. So some of the articulations that you laid out in a couple of these papers, I felt very excited that someone has seen a very similar kind of vision to what I see, but also a sense of is helpful to remember and come to grips with how much I still don't know of the mountain, and how much, I think I told you in the email, I feel very much a novice, in the sense that I feel like I'm a boy who stumbled upon a secret garden in some sense, and am in danger of being reckless if I'm not properly humble in relationship. So I'm very, very grateful for that.
I'm imagining that we're both sitting at a table in the downstairs lobby of a hostel at the base of Mount Sophia somewhere. And I feel the same, in that actually my discovery of that symbol is similar. It just seemed to spontaneously pop out almost in a throwaway line in one of my papers, and then gradually has just been accumulating weight and depth over time. In one of my papers, I had been doing a survey of different philosophical and metaphysical traditions and relating them to parts of speech and exploring that. I was writing the article for a book called Dancing with Sophia, Integral Philosophy on the Verge. So that symbol, that figure of Sophia, goddess of wisdom, was in my mind. But I had mostly approached the paper in an academic way, and then at the end decided to wax a little bit poetic and frame it all as us having just taken a tour of various temples on the side of Mount Sophia. And the feedback I got on that after the paper is that you probably should have led with that. You should have really started the journey with that mountain metaphor and then used it as a frame for the entire thing. And I didn't go back and revise the paper, but going forward, I did carry that in my mind, that maybe this symbol has more to yield. And gradually it has over time. It's been a wonderful journey so far, but I've also regarded it as just a little idiosyncratic thing I'm doing. And so when I found out that, you were having your own explorations up and down the sides of Mount Sophia, it also really gave me the feeling and the anticipation that actually there is more to discover here. And if there are other people journeying across this topology, maybe we can find something that will surprise us both. So that was really the impetus behind my invitation to you.
Yeah.
In Inca tradition, especially the Q'ero people, they've been relatively hidden. They started coming forward and interacting more with the modern world in the maybe late 80s, something like that, but they still mostly keep to themselves. But they have a word called Itu Apu. And an Apu, one, is the spirit of the mountain. But Itu Apu means the mountain of reference, your mountain of reference. And that there are life paths among these people that orient around particular mountains. And it is a dialogical and a participatory and deeply exploratory sacred relationship that builds over time as you get to know all the different slopes, all the different medicines that grow there, all the different caves and things that might be there, the different ways that it actually gives you access to the heavens. So there's a deep relationship that grows there, and I like that phrase, the Itu Apu. And for me, slowly, Mount Sophia has become my mountain of reference.
Yes, I like that a lot, especially the notion of the participation with the landscape, because I think that's, in some sense, maybe why the symbol of the mountain is capable, because maybe that's a good way of thinking about symbols is what are they capable of showing you, or what are they capable of holding up? And in some sense, for us as human beings, and maybe throughout our lineage in time, evolutionarily, a mountain is the thing that can hold. It's the thing that is maybe strong enough to bear the weight of the conceptual landscape in here. Because really that's what we're doing, I think, is, at least I feel like that's what I'm doing, is finding something on which a symbol strong enough that can bear up under the weight of the concept space that is held in my own understanding of the world, and allow it to become orderly, because that's a lot of what we're doing. At least that's what a lot of what I experience when I'm participating with this symbol is a learning how to discover and order, and discover and order. It's this reciprocal opening and or complexification, and then integration with concepts that I've held in my mind over time, but they never had a proper space. They never had a proper space from which to relate to the other. And I think in a lot of ways that was because I didn't have somewhere to hold them. I didn't even know that there was a somewhere they were, in a sense. They just would kind of flow in and out. But it's almost as if holding that symbol in the imaginal space and working through the imaginal space with the cognitive machinery, that you can begin to allow those concepts to become what they are, and then you can circumnavigate. I loved in your guided visualization of the temples on Mount Sophia. I love that, because that call to the imaginal space and the use of it in this symbolic but also deeply rational manner of addressing the ideas. It felt so. It felt as if the things that I had seen or experienced were articulated and visualized in a way that actually did them justice. And so I'm very grateful to you for that, first of all. But noting that circumambulation kind of sense as you go to these places and you look at these things, I think allowing a landscape for these concepts to exist on, independent of just my own self, has kind of allowed for a lot of a move away from egocentrism. And so all that to say, there's a little bit of how I look at the mountain and what it's meant for me to begin to participate with that symbol in that. I'm sorry, I don't remember the proper words. Itu apu, to begin to participate with the spirit of the mountain in that sense.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing what you did about it. My visualization's impact on you. I'm really glad to hear that, because sometimes those kind of things feel very idiosyncratic and not sure where they're going to land. So much came up for me while you were talking about that. Several layers to it. One, John likes to talk about inventio, and in my own research on these things, especially drawing from what I call prepositional philosophers like Bruno Latour and Michel Serres, they use a word called instauration. And instauration is drawn from French, but it means something very similar to inventio. It's both something that you work to uncover, but in the uncovering, you create it anew. You're also entangled in its becoming, in its
Mhm.
poesis, right?
Mhm.
So there is I like what you point out about, in a way, decentering from ego, because that process of instauration or inventio, one, you feel like, yes, I'm contributing something. I'm, through my questioning and through my interaction, I'm making something a little bit new, but at the same time, there's this deep sense of there being a there already to feel into and to be surprised by, and that will resist your initial assumptions. So I really find that nourishing. And in the integral post-metaphysical spiritual approach that sometimes we explore on this channel and that we're trying to bring into dialogue with John's religion that's not a religion, there's a big emphasis on enactment, that our spiritual practices are forms of participatory enactment of spiritual and existential and philosophical realities. So there's a deep sense in which we can't see what we're seeing as simply naked disclosures of reality as it is, but as something that's emerging between our own embodied engagement and interaction with that meaning space. And so I think a topology, a mountainscape, other kinds of things. I have a friend who sometimes appears on this channel, Greg Henriquez, and
Mm.
he's been on many episodes with John, and he has the symbols of the tree and the garden and the elephant sun god and the path. So again, these grounding symbols that allow for an embodied interface, I think is really beautiful and powerful, especially among the prepositional philosophers I've been talking about, like especially Michel Serres. Topology is very big for him. You know, he knows the important role that geometry has played in philosophy and in refining, rational thought, but he prefers topology as a complex, multi-layered, nested space that really calls us into embodied, multidimensional, chiasmic, fleshy relate in Merleau-Ponty sense, fleshy relationship with being. And to me, that's deeply resonant, both with my Christian past and my integral present. That sense of a fleshy, embodied spirituality is very important. And the last thing I'd want to add, that kind of inspired by what you just shared, is that reference to circumambulation. And I'm in part, in one of my papers, I'm calling that a ontochoreography, but I think more generally, because that ontochoreography has a very particular reference, but more generally, I feel like the thought spaces that we're entering into now, where we are awake to the riches and the depths that are in our inherited mythic traditions from the legacy religions, as John calls them, the different mythic paths and the many contemplative practices that have been developed both among indigenous cultures and traditionally religious, the mainstream religious cultures, but also modern rational thought, philosophy, cognitive science, AI, all of those things. I think we are surrounded now in such a plural space that something like the act of circumambulation is needed to begin to pull forward some sense of coherence and depth of meaning, that somehow resists alighting too long in one space. That we need to keep up that circulation to some degree to call forward an integration out of the plurality of streams of knowledge and wisdom and culture in which we're immersed in our global society these days.
Yeah. Through all of that you were saying, then what kept coming up for me was just, the notion of the symbol as such. And that's something that I've been paying a lot of attention to for a while now, and noticing the way in which we've often perceived things around us as symbols, not so much we've lost, and I mean that in the deep sense of looking through them, seeing not just an object, but being able to see through that object into what can be, say, held in relation to that object, and the manner in which it's held in relation to other objects, maybe. And I think we've obviously, in the legacy religions, we did a lot better job of understanding how to do that in the past. And I think that's where a lot of that mythology comes from. And I think Jonathan Pageau does a great job of, he was super helpful for me to start to break open Christianity in this way. But one of the things that's happened through that I've noticed, and I'm even noticing as you're saying those things, especially this notion of the plurality and almost overwhelming complexity of information now available. And it's created the hyper specialization space. And because of that, there's no sense of the whole. It's like I'm hyper specialized in medicine, so I don't know anything about philosophy, right? And in some sense, I think that's the harsh fluorescent light of discursive, reductive theorizing has pulled everything apart in a sense of those symbols, and but in the pulling apart of them and holding them tightly, there's so much tension bound up in all of it that there's this way in which the information has to come back together. And we can't all hold that tension. Maybe that's a way of even talking about the meaning crisis. So for me, what I've noticed has started to happen in relation to this symbol is a flip from looking out at symbols to flipping it to see myself as the symbol. Just being human as the symbol. And noticing that what's going on at a deeper level, or maybe the deepest level, at least that I can push to, is I'm really trying to explore the symbol of what it means to be human. And look through this portal and notice all the ratio religio of this symbol.
One thing you were saying about the power of the symbol to hold the weight of our concepts. There's something about the mountain, and I think us in as through the mountain, that one of the powers of that symbol is that both it's incredibly weighty and grounding, and it exceeds us. It's something that just immediately confronting it, we can see that there is an excess there that is beyond our immediate grasp. Or you could say it withdraws into the mists, it withdraws into the clouds. And that's a big part of object-oriented philosophy these days, is to point at the withdrawal of things. And one of the things that I have found in reflecting on that is it's actually the withdrawal of things that has pulled me into loving relationship with things, because it confronts me immediately with its transcendence of my utilitarian grasp, my egoic needs, it's going to always exceed that. At least the degree to which we recognize that withdrawal and that excess is the degree to which we can begin to open to other as other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe you could even look at it as a kind of paradox, but it's really opening to the other as other, that love will bring you into a form of identity, but it's not one that has been immediately captured by propositional knowledge or ego projects or anything like that. So it's something that in its hugeness confronts us with, I don't know if you've come across what is his name? There's a book called Speculative Grace, and I'm trying to remember the author's name. But he tries to articulate a Latourian and a object-oriented approach to faith and grace.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I think he takes a phrase from Latour talking about pulverized transcendence. That transcendence now for us, it really feels like it's democratically distributed, that it's not bound up in a single figure that is then set apart from everything else, but that has that figure has been dissolved into everything, so that the transcendence of that, in a sense, is now discovered in and through every part. And the object-oriented approach, in a way, is trying to show that everything has its own excess, its own withdrawn core, that invites us into a new kind of participatory, responsive, almost neo-animistic relationship with objects, without necessarily mythologizing them in a primitive way, but mythologizing them in the best way, right? In the way that's really deeply existentially engaging.
Yeah, the word that comes up for me through so much of what you're saying there is humility, and humility in a proper sense. Then the shift of turning around, in some sense, from a need to hold all these things, that switching from the having mode to the being mode in the interior space of allowing the ontology of reality to be held in reality instead of held in me. And that, to me, in some sense, the moment when I didn't know it at the time, but maybe the right way to say it is the moment that Mount Sophia engaged me is the moment that I talked about in my first conversation with John, where I had kind of a metanoia, which I used the language of being born again, because I think that's what is actually being talked about by Christ when he talks to Nicodemus. And what spurred that for me was an understanding or an insight around the notion of original sin and the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and recognizing that what that, at least to me, what that is all really about is the transition of the arbitration of ontology to the individual self, instead of an ontology beyond, kind of fundamentally transcendent from my own perspective. And so, it's certainly not always that way for me now in my daily life, but in some sense, the project that has been working on me maybe since that time has been to actualize that way of seeing everything in reality, whether it's I think that's what's helped me a lot with moving into this space of exploring Mount Sophia is I try to give that kind of ontology away from myself into the space of the conceptual ideas, and then actually have this imaginal movement of walking through and observing the ideas and the concepts in relation to each other and noticing where tensions lie, and then just kind of trying to look at them and trying to follow them a little bit. And sometimes you make progress and sometimes you don't, but because there's this shift in ontology, I didn't know Plato very well, but I recently have been reading D.C. Schindler's Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, and the way he presents Socrates and Plato and the whole Platonic corpus, it was an incredibly resonant experience for me to read that book, because that's what it feels like for me to move out of this space of, sophistry, of trying to hold everything and this is here, to no, I'm just going to walk around and look and notice that, like you said, in that kind of propositional holding, that's just gone. That's necessarily the case that the way in which I represent things in a proposition is at least, if not more, wrong than it is right.
There's something both ancient and new, about this for me. If you study Aboriginal culture or Apache culture, I was just in Apache land day before yesterday. So much of their ontology, their history, their mythology is rolled into the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And everything speaks not only of itself, but of the myths, the stories, the history, particular characteristics. I listened to an Apache gentleman talking one time about how his grandmother was able to correct him when he was engaged in an egocentric activity. All she had to do in a prideful activity that was not looked well upon by the elders in the community, all she had to do was point over to a feature of the landscape and just give him a little look. And that feature of the landscape called forth for him all kinds of teaching stories that related to that moment. And so there's a sense of living in and inhabiting a multi-layered place where there's the gross reality and the subtle and deeper, and they're all nested and layered. So I think that's something that I think probably in our own deep lineages, we've all come from places and cultures that related and lived in ways like that. And in integral thought, this, on my channel, that's one of the themes. We look at metamodernism and integral thought and game B and critical realism and, a number of these themes, that movements that all seem to be moving in a similar space. But in integral thought, there's an idea of something called vision logic. Have you really heard about that phrase or anything? So the idea, which it can relate to Jungian thought, but it's connected to other things as well, but Freudian thought as well. But we have, you could say, the autosymbolic imagination, which is very active in children, and it allows children to navigate in the world in a very participatory way, storied way. But a lot of that gets shut down as we move out of concrete operational thinking into formal operational thinking, and we basically, not everybody, but a lot of people, lose access to autosymbolic imagination. And typically, when individuals begin to go through existential crisis and they begin to really confront their own mortality, the limitations of the projects in which they've been engaged, the ways that they have shut down their bodies through defenses, which inhibits the flow of energy through our systems, and usually focused in on certain accepted ways of feeling and expressing and participating in culture. As you begin to work through that, there's often a resurfacing of the autosymbolic imagination, which can show up in big dreams and other kinds of experiences. And Michael Washburn is a person who really has a wonderful exploration of that passage. He relates it back to the Garden of Eden and some very interesting narrative lines that he follows there. But in any event, vision logic, then what that involves is the integration of the autosymbolic imagination of visionary capacity with trained formal operational capacities, and they begin to be synthesized and integrated. So sometimes it's also called network thinking, but it's, network is too flat. So vision logic tries to evoke the sense of marshaling, John's 4 P's. That's really what it's talking about, is moving out of just the familiar orbit in the propositional to begin to reclaim the perspectival and the participatory and integrate those things with the procedural and the propositional, to build out a more multidimensional way of engaging and experiencing the world. And again, some people as artists and others remain more in touch with those things than others. But I wanted to just go through that because I really feel like what we're talking about and the impact of working with the symbol system, like a landscaped symbol system or something like that, invites us ever more deeply, I think, into those into the play of those modes with each other, which I think can invoke a vision logic space.
Yes. It speaks to me a great deal about the embeddedness. And in some sense, that's become kind of the core project of what I try to focus on in my life, is how embedded am I in, or at least that seems to be the thing that brings me back to myself. Maybe when I've gotten lost in the weeds, is the question of how embedded am I in this moment? How rich is the texture of whatever this thing I'm experiencing? And when I seem to recall as a child that visualization or that imaginal space was so prescient and so maybe even a dominant mode of connecting to reality. And it seems like it was connected to a lower density of data. Because my data load in my conceptual space was lower, the imaginal was much more free to develop, the fairy out of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe as we increase our data load and also increase not just the complexity, but the complication of that conceptual space. Maybe it's the complication, because I'm thinking of complicated as opposed to complex in the way that Jordan Hall talks about it. And there's a sense of rigidity to complicated that complex doesn't necessarily have. And it's almost the rigidity of the data dense space that doesn't allow for that symbolic visualization to occur.
I think that's a good distinction. Yeah, that I resonate with that. And there's a sense of, complicated being brittle. I like that. And complexity with the plex is the fold.
Mhm.
And I really think these topographic, symbols or metaphors, if you're thinking about the landscape, they really bring to mind this sense of a folding and a layering
Mm.
that is rich and alive and is flowing. And I like also what you say about seeing how deeply embedded you are, as a way to kind of come back to yourself in these kinds of explorations. And one of my influences has been David Bohm, and he's a quantum physicist, but also a philosopher. And I'm in dialogue with one of the people who has followed up from David Bohm in carrying forward his dialogue method. And he really emphasizes a couple aspects of David Bohm's work on the holosoma and the rheosoma. And Bohm has an idea that he calls soma significance and signosomatics, but it's that at all layers, there's an intersection of form, meaning, and energy, and that every form signifies, and every signification evokes a form. And there's this folding together of these things at explicate and implicate layers, right? So where especially Lee Nickel takes, Bohm has talked about flowing wholeness, and so the idea of the holosoma and the rheosoma, basically the holosoma is the body in its embedded participation with the whole, right? And to make a practice of connecting to that.
Mhm.
And rheosoma is the flowing body, rheo, and that basically is in that connecting in and feeling into the wholeness of the body and participation with everything else. As you move into that, you begin to thaw those brittle structures. And you feel yourself entering into more of a flowing relationship, responsive, dialogical relationship with being.
Yeah, that for me evokes strongly the notion of repentance and participation with grace. Because I've talked a lot with my friend Steve. He uses the framing of quantum physics quite a lot, and it's been very, very helpful for me. But thinking of the conceptual frame space and these points of rigidity as the arbitrary spaces in which we've gotten in the way of participating with what is by claiming what is not. And that the means by which that happens, or the happening of it, maybe, is what this notion of sin is, properly understood and made, I don't know, updated into the vision logic kind of conceptual way of dealing with it, is those spaces where we have been disconnected from being because of a switch of the ontology or of the ontological arbiter. That's what this notion of sin is about. And the notion of repentance and participation with grace is the moving, or the allowance or affordance of fluidity back into whatever space we've held as rigid. And sometimes that involves actually going and looking at that space and allowing it to dissolve. And maybe in some ways where we're incapable of doing that, it can happen on its own. But that's what, because one of the things that I've done that I've done. That's not the right way to say it. One of the things that seems to be a theme of my life and this journey is trying to taking this whole Christian framework that I was very fortunate to be absolutely drenched in as a child. My upbringing was fully permeated by, actually kind of a fundamentalist Christian frame. But what that meant is that I got the propositions of it. Like those were so deeply ingrained in my very being. And then now turning around and sort of doing that to them, right? Allowing them all to become fluid. And then starting to try to look through them. And when you brought up the notions of grace and faith earlier, those have both over the past maybe month or two become these spaces that I've been looking at and trying to actively go to and map on Mount Sophia, because I think those are, what are they? They're integral functions by which the mountain becomes accessible, and also integral functions that make reality what it is. So you can come at them from almost any angle and still find them behind you, or underneath you maybe. So I'll stop there before I just jump into those.
I've dipped into one of your videos where you were beginning to talk about faith, so I'm very interested in what you're going to share with that. I also have a Christian background, and I didn't have a fundamentalist upbringing, and my parents held Christianity rather loosely, but after a series of tragedies that happened in my own life and especially during high school, it really drove me deeply into looking at, a way forward that would be meaningful. And I looked to Christianity for that. And I went, I think, fairly deeply into it, very committed in my practice of it, and contemplated becoming a monk to a degree of, writing letters of inquiry to multiple monasteries and meeting with people. And so I was quite serious about that for a while. And
Sure.
I think it was Augustine. My memory's a little bit foggy, but I think it was Augustine who talked about turning away from God in order to find God. And I remember that at some point eventually deeply resonated with me. That was something I was going to need to do, that I could see while my explorations had been nourishing. I didn't have, I think, very good, deep, wise guidance around me, even though I tried to find it. I found it in some books, but not in people. And I could see that a lot of what I was chasing were figments of my own need and imagination. And I didn't totally discount those things. I figured those needs and longings are rooted in being, and but I also didn't feel that they were that reliable, that I was setting up idols. And that, so I'm bringing this up because I'm at my mother's house, and she pulled out an old journal of mine from back in the 80s, I guess. And that's what I saw I was writing back then. Dear Lord, I need to turn my back on you in order to better find you. So please bless this journey.
Wow.
So for me, it looks like a move towards apostasy. Especially that's how it was received in the Christian college I was attending.
Sure.
But I can say I felt in a deep way the nature of faith and grace are such that my turn towards being in earnestness won't go wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So this, for me, I think we've had a very similar experience in this sense, although mine was much less conscious. I would say mine was much more kind of mystical and subconscious, which in some ways has, I think, been helpful for me because I recognize that there's no way in which I can claim credit for the journey I've been on. That is a deeply held sense for me, and I am grateful for it. But I also didn't understand what was happening, which has been an interesting part of the journey. But to pick up on what you're saying, I think that is bound up. Like, you're talking about faith there so deeply, because to really engage in faith is to recognize that the good, the true, and the beautiful will be good, true, and beautiful regardless of what your relationship to them is. And that, I think, where a lot of it's difficult to find language that is appropriately strong but not possibly offensive, where Christianity has been bound, I think, because that's the way I look at Christianity. I think that it's like this, I don't even know what all it is, but it's like held in chains, deeply held in chains and guarded by many dragons. And that, maybe in some sense it is the Virgin, held in the chains by the dragons. And one of the primary chains is this notion of that what it means to be a Christian, or what it means to participate, is somehow an articulated or specified manner of being in relation to the good, the true, and the beautiful, rather than a much more radical existentialized shift in the manner of and mode of relating to reality itself, and thereby hoping to discover the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that is, it's devastating how much the thing in itself is lost by those who most want it. Because there's this invisible wall between them and God, really, but it's a wall that they hold of their own self because they want so much to be in right relationship with God.
In the conversation that we had with John in our last episode of Rethinking Religion, I mentioned Jean-Luc Nancy talking about the auto-deconstruction, the self-deconstruction of Christianity as, in some sense, the fulfillment of its own narrative, the enactment of its own narrative. And I don't know that that's necessarily true, though John told me at the Consciousness and Conscience conference, there was some talk about that maybe Christianity is going through its own death and possible rebirth. I'm not thinking really about that as a sociological or historical reality, but more of a existential movement. And for me, I wish I had found some living communities that could engage with certain things that I felt about Christianity that I don't think were just my ideas, but were things that were coming through a living relationship with the teachings and with confrontations with death and many things like that, and many mystical types of experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I left all of it behind and went on, journeys through many traditions, and especially deep in a couple of them.
Mm.
And I found at one point, really in the depths of practicing Tantra and Dzogchen within the Tibetan tradition, I was learning all kinds of beautiful teachings and profound practices. And a lot of them spoke to me deeply. But in the midst of that, I think I had been deeply imprinted enough with some of the Christian mythos that I wanted and longed for those practices and processes to be approached through that symbol system.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was just because, having been immersed in it, I'd come to embody it in some way, in a way that I couldn't quite embody the images from this other culture.
Mm-hmm.
But those images and those practices from the other culture showed me a kind of a way into touching the good, the true, and the beautiful, that I felt a bit of hunger for being able to do that within the symbol system that was most native to me.
Mm-hmm.
I experimented with that a little bit, but it didn't become a path. But I'm not sure if I'm sharing anything that is pushing our dialogue forward here. I just wanted to say that I think there's something that it's been my experience and experience of many people that I've known, that the farther out from our own native traditions we explore, we often can then look back and see what has been within them and neglected or not fully manifest. And so for me, it's come back to, I don't see it being practiced anywhere very significantly in the way that I can relate to, enough to bring me back into going to a church. But I can look back at those things now and feel whatever I am doing in terms of philosophical exploration, spiritual practice, I can identify with it as much as a Christian movement as a Tibetan one or another one. And so there's a kind of lightly held polytheism, but what I would call heno-ontology. In my paper, I talked about heno-ontology. And are you familiar with that phrase or that word, heno-ontology, or heno? Yeah.
I read it in your paper. I'm not sure that I understand it well. If you'd mind sharing, that would be great.
Technically, it's actually cateno theology, or sometimes it's heno-ontology, or actually, I made up heno-ontology, but it's henotheology or cateno theology. It's more what you find in Indian systems, where there's a recognition of the fluidity of symbols, and both the power to yield indefinite depths and always to be incomplete. So it's not polytheism in the sense of there's this God and that God and that God and that God, but that the multiple symbols are all ways of approaching reality and being. And you don't absolutize the symbols, though you can for pragmatic, participatory, and active purposes. If I approach this symbol in this way, what does reality have to show me? And if I approach this symbol in that way, what does that dialogue reveal? And there's a deep faith and trust that there is something maybe absent but active in and through each.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of Henri Bortoff's notion of the counterfeit and authentic wholes, where counterfeit whole is the whole that you identify alongside all the parts. Here's all the parts, and this is the master whole. That's a counterfeit whole. You can't encounter the whole as something arrayed alongside the parts. You can only encounter the whole as an active absence. The absence is what presence is forth, bodies forth through the parts, and can be felt in our dialogical, intimate approach to and through the parts. You can feel, you can intuit the presence of that whole that is active in an organizing, integrative, communicative way. But it doesn't show up as an object. It doesn't show up as a propositional structure, right? So I think that's where I've somewhat landed in terms of my own spiritual practice. I'm quite comfortable to talk about it in Christian terms or Tibetan or Hindu or anything. And I don't think I don't really like all roads lead to the same mountain peak. To me, it has some utility to it and some limitations. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I resonate strongly with all of that, because that's very much, what you said about getting away and getting new perspective. That has been very much the case for me. It's in the moments where I find myself much more of a Buddhist that I find myself mostly Christian. And that's an odd thing, I think, for most people to hear, because there's this sense of exclusivity between the matters. And maybe that's a little bit of the tension that I feel, because I feel the same way about the notion of all roads lead to the same mountain peak. Because there's a sense in which it's true, but there's also a sense in which it's not.
Right.
And to me, maybe part of where it's not is it maintains some sense of them being separate. All roads, well, they're actually different. And they are, but the strange thing about symbolism is that the symbols are fluid, as you said. So, there's this weird way in which the different path is the same path, looked at through a different set of eyes. And in a lot of ways, it's this sense of exclusivity, I think, that is so difficult for us to overcome because of our need to feel as if we are correct. And that's the giant we're all fighting. It's just, maybe it's a giant that has different hold points on different of these traditions. The Christian ones are quite explicitly propositional, I think. The ways in which it's held to be exclusive, they're in a very propositional space, and as such, a practice, especially coming from a more modern Christianity, more modern Protestant Christianity, that's all propositional almost, moving into something like the Buddhist space and the practices and the embedding kind of stripping away of the self, that you start to notice, oh, okay, there's this thing that was locked in the propositional suddenly becomes real.
Right. Yeah, that's been a really beautiful thing, and to me, I'm just speaking on a surface level first, in a way within Christianity, that's actually so easy to remedy. There are simple practices that just in their enactment let you touch something that then lets you look back at what the propositional was pointing to, but there was no way to embody it within the tradition in which it was carried. At least not in the same way, at least the same depth that I've been able to find with that. In one of my papers, which I share with you, I use that symbol, the prepositional symbol of within, with/in, as an orientation that is not exclusivism, it's not inclusivism, and it's not pluralism as the way it's usually articulated, which is either everybody has a piece of the truth, or everybody's approaching the truth, but everybody's wrong, or they're all leading to the same identical place, but there are multiple paths, so they're all valid, and you can't make any distinctions really between them. And I'm not satisfied with any one of those approaches. Right? For me, within, it's deeply Trinitarian, it's deeply circumsessional or perichoretic in the Trinitarian sense, in the ways that the figures of the Trinity are both distinct and the ways that they enfold and participate in each other, but without losing their distinctness and their characteristics. So Son is not reducible to the Spirit or to the Father, and yet the Son includes both. And you can, that dancing around with each other, it's one way to look at it within the Christian frame. And there are similar framings in Neoplatonism, and of course deeply in Buddhism. There are many metaphors to get at that kind of holographic relationship, where things are, Bhaskar calls it the universal unique, I think, or actually concretely universal, and TSK, my other tradition, calls it universal unique, but it's pointing towards that which uniquely embodies the whole, and through which the whole can be approached in an authentic way. So I like to look now at traditions in that light, that they each, in their authentic depths, can afford that meaningful kind of contact. Where, Raimon Panikar would talk about the need for topological transformation in order to interpret across religious boundaries. And that we can't say that Allah is Brahman, is Yahweh, right? And yet they serve homeomorphically equivalent functions within the ecologies, within the topologies of those spaces. So anyway, I think that something like what I try to evoke on a philosophical level with Mount Sophia, with the different temples, to the different parts of speech, can also be approached theologically that way. And I might say something about the temples and parts of speech, but I'll stop right here right now. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I was wondering, there's several places that I could jump off with what you were just saying, but I wanted to talk to you also and hear a little bit what you think relating to we've talked about the mountain, but Sophia, and specifically maybe the feminine goddess kind of symbolism there.
Yeah. There's a couple ways I could look at it. One is, fairly simple and light, playful. Where I live now, where I'm staying right now, I live in California, but I'm staying right now in Arizona with my mother, and a common little statue that you find all around is the large mother figure and tiny little child figures sitting all over the entire mother figure.
Mm.
And of course, that's just, mother and children. But to me, it's also, I'm pausing because this could open up maybe too much of a tangent, but one of my most significant mystical experiences involved very powerful sense of sitting on the motherly lap of the earth.
Mm.
I was living at a Krishnamurti school in India, teaching creative writing there and doing a lot of meditation and dialogue. One of my regular practices was to just take a walk along the Ganges River and around all of the grounds, and to watch the movement of thought and be sensitive to the spaces between thought. And I was doing that practice and walking along the river. And at one point, there was a large black snake that crossed my path and went into a hole in the ground. And the phrase, Shiva knows his bride in silence, just popped in my mind. There was this male-female union with that very sensual movement of that black snake. And I kept going and walking and just doing that contemplation. And then I came to a place where there was a little mound on the earth. The sun was setting. There were a lot of peacocks gathering in the field and beginning to fly up to roost in the trees. And the sun was just coming through. The mound of the earth was warm. And I just sat down on the mound of the earth. And I don't know what happened, except just whatever the contemplation had been, it just dissolved into that moment. And something profoundly shifted in me, where there was no narrative center, there was no observing center. Everything was equally present in multidimensional space, and thought was incidental to that, in terms it didn't carry gravity, it didn't hook identity. It was one element in a play of many things that could come and go, and it didn't really matter. And the sense of the body opened up to, I've jokingly called it to friends, the champagne body, because head to toe, everything was sparkling and appearing and disappearing. And I could just feel like, I think the Buddhists call it kalapas, the tiny atoms of experience manifesting. So anyway, that opened up, and that state lasted for a couple days. And my encounter with friends actually is what ultimately drove me out of it, because they thought I had fallen deeply in love. Tell me about her. Who is, what happened to you? Why have you changed? And I don't know if it was necessary to go into that story, but for me,
thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful.
That sitting on that lap of the earth, touching into being in that way, was for me it was held in a very feminine space. And for me, I deeply connect that accommodating and capacitating motherly lap with the feel of Mount Sophia for me.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. I resonate with that deeply. I am also so deeply grateful that I can feel a little bit of what you're saying. And you know, the sense of the hyper reality related to, because the feminine aspect, you know, it's this seduction, right? There's this seductive aspect to it where it's hidden, but it calls to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that underlies this whole adventure and this whole dimension of the mountain that makes it what it is. And it's not just a mountain, or it's not just a sacred mountain, but it's the mountain of Sophia. It's the mountain of, maybe it's, you know, I guess for me, I think of Sophia as a particular side from which to view the sacred feminine.
Mm-hmm.
It's a particular aspect of mother, you know, mother and feminine in all its multi-aspectuality, but it's a particular one that is transcendent of all the multiplicity of aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they all lead back to a transcendent one, whether they appear so at first or not. But that the particular aspect of Sophia is the seduction to participate in reality at the kind of level like you're talking about, with a view towards the notion of wisdom. And that, you know, my experience has been, actually just a couple of days ago, had been feeling more kind of stress and pressure surrounding just the fact that my channel has garnered and my work has garnered a little bit of attention. Minimal though it may be, you know, I kind of like, I was feeling that. And we have some woods on our property that we walk through on a nearly daily basis, my wife and I. And I was out in the woods. Unfortunately, my wife wasn't with me because we just had a child, so she's not ready to do that yet. But I had an encounter, I would say, with the personage of Sophia. Mm-hmm. and radically felt the transcendence of that symbol and her own being in such a way that was so far beyond me that suddenly my participation, such as it is, minimal as it is, was shown to be what it was. And in the light, in that light, my sense of responsibility and pressure that I had been feeling dissolved into just a sense of pure gratitude to be able to be present to it at all. And, since I brought my wife in a little bit, I don't think it's very proper for me to talk about my relationship to the feminine and Sophia without talking about my wife, because she has exemplified and called me into she's made herself a symbol of the feminine to me, and has participated with it in such a way that has allowed me to come into relationship with the feminine aspect of the divine that is I'm so grateful for, and I'm so grateful to her for.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and especially with the moment that you're in right now, having brought forth new life. Wonderful thing. I feel that also with my wife. There's a fragment of a poem. I mean, there's a poem, but one little slice out of it, it says, "You exceed me like a deer in a garden chase, you lead me."
Mm,
And I've had this sense of her through her sheer acceptance of me as I am in a way
mm,
that I hadn't experienced before with virtually anyone.
mm,
She's led me to be more of myself than I knew was there.
It's a beautiful way to say it. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the gifts of the feminine, and yeah, I relate to Sophia in that way. You know, I one of the manuscripts I sent you, I put a little image on the front of Sophia, and I'm not sure that that's my final representation. I found that on the internet and just decorated it with my symbols, but that's something I want to feel into is uh, artistic, appreciative exploration of that. You know, I notice you've got the nice mountain symbols in your channel. This image behind me is by a friend of mine, Todd Guess, but this is basically the six-sided Mount Sophia. But in any event, I feel like there's something, you know, thinking of Pajot, you know, of the work of the icon, right? That there is something sacred in that act of dialoguing with that reality in a way that you can invite it to show itself in a particular form. So I feel like, you know, through our conversations, but maybe through other means, you know, uh, this invitation to let to let the goddess show herself.
Mm,
Um, yeah,
mhm,
and you know, in terms of Christianity, in my own background there, yes, we had in my own upbringing some relationship to Mary, but it wasn't strong. I was more on the Episcopalian side than the Catholic. So Mount Sophia, Sophia, and the Mount Sophia kind of
mm,
fill a gap that I experienced within the Christian mythos.
mhm,
Right.
mhm,
Um, my one of the essays I showed you called Sophia Speaks, but of course it's also I'm thinking about from the Christian side. There's a lot of ways to frame it. I'm just doing it for the benefit of our conversation, but you know, God speaking the world into being.
mhm,
And with the linguistic turn in philosophy, you know, we began to look much more at the influence of language on our perception of reality. But and we grew increasingly suspicious of metaphysics to the point that we then really only started talking about language.
mhm,
And I think there's that's a beautiful move, but to me it's an incomplete move.
mm,
And I think we can't separate the speaking from being,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
That language speaks about being, but at the same time, being is speaking,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And I don't want to posit in any kind of, you know, literalist way that the parts of speech really correspond to these dimensions of reality. But to me, there's a way that we can honor our own speaking
mm,
as a mode of participation with and expression by being.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
And that if there are ways of framing and holding things that consistently show up across cultures and language groups, I feel, at least in terms of some kind of form of symbolic play, that there's value in mining, exploring, spelunking language, not only the symbols that language gives us through particular myths and stories and traditions, but language itself as symbolic of being. So, yeah, I don't know if in your own, when you were listening to that journey through, Mount Sophia, were there any of the particular parts of speech that stood out or resonated with you as representative of some dimensions of your own experience?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like they all did. One that felt especially kind of salient to me was the adjectival, the kind of shimmering appearances. And maybe that's just because that's where my attention is in my daily life right now, is learning how to be the philosopher back in the cave rather than the prisoner in the cave within the appearances. But yeah, I think, I don't know if it's helpful anymore, at least from my perspective, to necessarily privilege as better one of the manners to approach the mountain, so much as to take seriously and humbly and with gratitude whatever approach you're participating in. So, I think, language is so fundamental to all of this. And so taking it seriously is maybe the thing that matters. With a playful seriousness, as always, but being careful and serious and treating language, maybe it's treating language itself as an exploration. Noticing what manner or what posture our attention takes relative to the form of speech. That's a lot of what I was feeling and resonating with through what I was reading of what you sent me, and that that guided visualization was this sense of, what is the posture that I am placed in by the words I use. Which in a deep way is symbolic of how I see my whole participation in reality. Is, okay, how about instead of whatever else we think we're doing all the time, how about we just notice what posture our attention is being placed in based on the manner we're attempting to position ourselves in the reality we are in.
Right. And my friend, partner on my channel, Layman Pascal, he likes to point to the asana, the yoga asana, the different postures that we take in a yoga practice as themselves deeply communicative. And to attend, basically, I'm just trying to reinforce what you just said, because there's a way that we can tune into whatever asana we are holding, and begin to feel out participatorily what world we are instaurating through that particular asana. And just as an aside, because of your own work in the medical field, this is something I talked about with Layman many years ago. One of my first jobs was as a food delivery person within a hospital, and had some profound and challenging experiences there. But I was reminded of that experience listening to you talk, I think it was to Christopher, about one of your mentors who particularly impressed you, who would speak to the janitors and knew all their names and all of that, and how most of the doctors wouldn't do that. This is not a total tangent. This does connect, I promise.
It's okay.
When I was working in the hospital as a teenager, I was struck by the bodies and faces of the people I encountered, both the ill, but also the nurses and the doctors. And what struck me probably most strongly was the bodies and faces of the doctors. Most of them disturbed me. When I passed them in between rooms, they weren't with the patient. And of course, naively, at that time, I probably couldn't imagine into the complexity of all the things that they're holding in terms of who they're caring for and what they're facing, and what they probably just saw. But I could see a certain way of holding the face and holding the shoulders, that at that time when I would pass them in the hallway, as soon as I was past them, I would try to put myself into the same position. I would make my face the same, and I would make my body the same, and I would try to feel what their world is from that asana. And I don't know in my teenage mind that I really grasped wherever they were sitting, but that stayed with me as just a kind of imprinting to pay attention to exactly what you're saying, our posture in the world, and how that disposes us to what the world is presenting, and how that enables us or bars us from attending to all that is presenting.
Yes. And I think what you say is kind of emblematic of, I don't know if you saw, John recently had a conversation with Dr. Rusha Modi, I think is his name, talking about the meaning crisis in medicine. And I think that conversation was bang on and very much aligned with what you're saying here, of this sense of the posture that you hold contains within it, or is shaped by, maybe, the mountain from which you work internally, and that the disarray, disorder, tensions, or ossification and energy trapped in that ossification, or maybe used up to hold it in place, is maybe a better way to talk about it, comes out in the body and comes out in the interactions, and all these things. So yeah, I experience it a lot in medicine. I experience it within myself, and attempt to work through it. But yeah, in some sense, that's a bit of the crux of the whole project, is to how do we monitor and observe and then afford the transformation and transcendence of those postures through the postures that we find ourselves in.
I like how in your videos you frame your conversations as an adventure, and talk about the different tools you might need to move up and down. How do you think how has Mount Sophia taught you so far in terms of your own posture, your own way of being?
In some ways, I'm not sure exactly where to start, because in a lot of ways, I'm not sure who I was before. it's so difficult to find a boundary on these kinds of things, but it's also almost impossible to quantify, because I find a constant state of flux with the movement of participating with Mount Sophia. There are times that I can point very clearly to specific tools it has given me, or I've discovered in working on the slopes, you might say, or picked up from others mostly, right? And then there are ways of postures of becoming, or postures of being, and attitudes, and that I'm not sure, they're participatory, so they just kind of arose in some sense in me. So, the biggest and most significant ones, I think, are the ones that have just allowed me to find that it's real. The humility and release of faith to switch over out of the having mode and into the being mode, especially in the conceptual space. I still don't know exactly how that happened. I can point to the narrative around it, and I can point to aspects that I think afforded it, but the actual happening of it in some way, I think it's only proper to leave up to a kind of divine call from Sophia, and maybe a push from behind by Christ might be how I would talk about that.
I love that. Out here in Arizona, where my mother and I live, she bonded very deeply with a wolf and lived with the wolf for some years. She would go mountain climbing with the wolf. The wolf would run ahead on the mountain, then look down at her, kind of lead her into places that she might not have ventured by herself. But what was remarkable about it was that it always kept an eye on her. And there were several places where she was going up the slope and had lost sight of the wolf, and then started to slide down on the gravel, and the wolf showed up behind her feet and stopped her from toppling down.
Wow.
And so that, to me, I'm just connecting to your story about Sophia and about Christ, both pushing you from behind and also leading you on to undiscovered places yet along the slopes.
Wow, that's beautiful. That is amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. Well, I need to go shortly, but I'm so grateful to have gotten to talk to you. This has been amazing. I've really enjoyed it.
Same here. Yeah, really happy to meet a fellow traveler, and hope to listen to more of your explorations. And I'm working on a book together with Layman, so probably some references to Mount Sophia will still be explored in some coming pages. So looking forward to that. But yeah, thank you, fellow traveler. Thank you, Pilgrim.
Yes, indeed. And I at some point I'd love to. I'm always interested in chatting, or if anything seems, if at any point you want to explore some ground together and it seems like I might be helpful in any way, I would be interested in that, and I may reach out to you at some point as well if there's a particular ascent I'm hoping to make, and maybe feel that we could be a good team to do it together.
Wonderful. Yeah, definitely open to that. Well, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.